Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Jim Huffman with the Integrated Benefits Institute, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'm joined by my teammate, Carol Bonner, who led this research project and will share the key findings. We're very excited to be joined today by Dr. Kristen Tugman, CEO and founder of Tugman Consulting. We're also fortunate to be joined by Dr. Kimia Vagev, the Director of Value Engineering Leave Solutions at Alight. Welcome, Dr. Tugman and Dr. Vagev. We look forward to learning more about your roles, organization, and thoughts on this important topic. Would you each provide a brief description of your role and organization for our audience? Dr. Tugman, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Kristen Tugman. I newly lead an organization called Tugman Consulting. I like to joke that was quite the creative name for my business. But I started this consulting practice back in January, but have 25 years in the disability management, disability research, health and productivity space. And so I spent a little bit of time doing some private practice consulting and then joined corporate America and spent 14 years at Unum and 10 years at Prudential, and just decided at this point it's time to take my show on the road. So my work is really around health and productivity and helping employers figure out ways to maximize productivity and minimize absence through actionable solutions. So a lot of work around transition return to work, and that's actually where I've spent most of my research career, is looking at and studying the psychological processes around disability and return to work. So thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. Dr. Vagev?
Thank you for having me. Absolutely. I have some big shoes to fill with Dr. Tugman there, but I actually have similar organizational consulting background. I'm the director of Leave Solutions Value Engineering team. In particular, my team does a lot of analytics and consulting around insights for health, productivity, areas where we can see durations or incidents that can help key locations within organizations. And we really double down there and try to identify where organizations can identify some areas of opportunity, really, whether it's their levers or our levers. We're just in the collaborative process. And my background really is in statistics and organizational consulting. So really bringing the evidence-based results to those actionable insights that we're seeing in our data with our clients every day. My team is really great in kind of supporting those different elements within Alight. And so we see everything kind of integrated and how that integration fits in together. And ultimately, really, what working together to bring back the employees when they're healthy, when they're capable, in the best manner possible, and working within the employer's guidelines and programs. And so what we really like to focus on is that return to work strategy and those duration management pieces. So looking forward to talking about that today with everyone.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you both for joining us. I'll remind everyone we have 1 hour scheduled for today's session. We are recording, and we will distribute a copy of this recording as well as Carol's slides that will be available after the session. Now, please take advantage of the Q&A feature and submit your questions. We've blocked time at the end for a formal Q&A, but please don't hesitate. If something catches your attention as we go through the conversation, drop it in the Q&A and we'll certainly address it then. Now, our topic today is successful return to work strategies. You're going to learn more about evidence-based strategies for the modern workplace, insights from our industry experts, and real-world applications, and how you will be in a position to leave today's webinar with insights to really increase the return to work rates at your organization or your clients' organizations and reduce costs and improve employee satisfaction. So a tall order, but I know we've got the right team of people to do it, and the research that Carol's going to highlight will certainly give you some insights. So let's get started. Carol, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I'm excited about today's webinar. And hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today to talk about some of the issues in the absence management space, and that is successful return to work strategies. I'm going to talk about evidence-based strategies to maximize that return to work success. We will talk about what the experts say from the front lines, and you will walk away with data-based, actionable ways to improve your success. So every year we poll our stakeholders, our more than 1,600 members, and find out what's keeping them up at night. And improving return to work success was one of the top priorities. So with that in mind, this research will identify effective strategies and interventions that address barriers and challenges in that return to work process. So simply put, in a nutshell, what we want is to optimize the return to work success. And what we need is a comprehensive return to work program. And we know from the literature, from white papers, everywhere out there, that employees in comprehensive return to work programs return 1.4 times faster than those without support. And I guess the question is, what does comprehensive mean? And that's what I set out to establish. So the methods that I used in this research were grounded in real data and practical insights. The study followed a two-phase research approach. First, we conducted a systematic review, meticulously examining high-quality research published between January 2020 and March 2025. Our focus was on studies involving working-aged adults with various injuries and illnesses, so it's across injuries and illnesses. We organized the findings using the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health Framework, which many of you are familiar with. It is the World Health Organization's framework from which ICD-10 codes are derived. And it's how they built their return to work framework. Next, we held focus groups. We had two focus groups. These were seasoned industry professionals, and the first group was composed of 3 experts, and the second also 3 experts. And what you will see today is that Dr. Tugman was in that second group, and Dr. Bagev was in that first group. So lastly, I took the findings from these two phases and integrated it into a comprehensive evidence-based framework addressing real-world return to work challenges. So that focus, in that focus group, we were looking at where the gaps were. And I was looking at how the framework could be improved, what is often overlooked or undervalued. And from those discussions, I was able to build out a framework. So first, that everybody emphasized, the literature emphasizes, early intervention is crucial. By connecting with the claimant early, we can significantly improve outcomes for individuals returning to work. This is well known, but often not done. So it's at that point that you're making the claimant feel seen and important, and you're setting positive expectations. The first month is crucial. A simple gesture like check-in call or we're thinking of you note can make a huge difference in keeping people connected. So when people are out of work too long, their mindset starts to shift. They see themselves less as someone returning and more as someone who's out on disability. This is referred to as the disability mindset, and Kristen has written extensively about this in her works, and I'm going to let her speak more about it.
Sure. Thanks, Carol. So the disability mindset is certainly a term that I think everyone in the disability management space talks about probably on a daily basis. I would say most of us feel like we have a good understanding of what the disability mindset is. But I think to an extent, it's almost like we take it sort of for granted. And I say that because there's just so much more that goes into it, I think, than we take into account in our daily work. So I think about it like this. It's sort of like the disability management key to the kingdom is this middle bucket of claimants that we know should be returning to work, but they're just not. And we also know in the disability management space that we get information from doctors that can be less than objective, but it doesn't necessarily give us enough information to take somebody off of a disability claim. And so there's a lot of work and churning that goes into that middle bucket. And so the idea is, right, there's people that will, there's a bucket of folks that are just going to self-resolve. They're going to return to work, whether or not we intervene. There, unfortunately, are a group of folks that are permanently and totally disabled, and we want to focus on them in a way that gets them to a place of feeling like they have meaning in their lives. But then there's that middle bucket that I referenced that really is the key to this puzzle that we're all trying to figure out in this disability management space. And so what is happening? So the idea really is that there is a psychological component to any disability event. So if we can go into the disability management space thinking that the event that has occurred, that has taken somebody out of work, whether or not it's diagnosable, is a psychological event, that helps us think about it in a different way. And so I always say that there's two things, actually. One, I've said throughout my career, and that's that if I can get the disability industry to stop saying the words, "Is the person motivated to return to work?" I will have been successful. Because it doesn't matter if the person is motivated to return to work. In our space, it's our job to figure out what is motivating them. Because they're motivated for something. They just might not be motivated for what you think they should be motivated for. And that's where the disability mindset comes into play. And it's really a race. This is the other thing is we talk about early intervention. The second that somebody is experiencing a decline in performance due to an emerging disability condition, it is a race for us to prevent the disability mindset, because what we know happens is that there's some level of shame typically that occurs because I'm not performing as I once did. We all know that our employers, or as employers, we don't have employees that we don't need. And so there's this obligation around, I've got to be as productive as possible so that I'm not creating more work or undue hardship or headaches for my coworkers or my manager. So there's that shame. And if we can intervene even then, we're going to be in a much better place. But so an individual goes out of work, typically what we see, and then a really important interaction occurs. They might feel the shame and concern around being out of work. And I've seen that where people immediately think, geez, how am I going to provide for myself and my family? But then they go to the doctor. And we all know doctors don't necessarily think about job descriptions or restrictions and limitations. They're treating patients. And then there's this interaction that occurs that's really important where the doctor says, okay, so you can't work. How long do you need to be out? And they sort of give control over to the then claimant, who then might counter and give control back to the doctor to say, well, I'm just going to return to work when my doctor says I can. So there's that advocacy piece where the person then is asked, why can't you work? And so they start to defend why they can't work. And then the natural thing that occurs within the disability space is that we pay somebody to be disabled. And income replacement is wildly important, right? We need to have these benefits because we're all at risk of having a time period where we can't work. But if I've been defending my disability and no one's talked to me about the expectation that they're going to help me get back to productivity, and somebody pays me for being really sick, that then reiterates in my mind that wow, I must be really sick and I'm getting paid to be out of work. And so that puts us further on the path to the disability mindset. And then ultimately, disability is about consequence. I did a phenomenological study, actually, sort of restudied the phenomenon several times, but originally in my dissertation, it was really about what is the experience of return to work and disability, and it's really about consequence. So if I feel like the consequence of my returning to work is greater than the consequence of staying out of work, I'm more likely to stay out of work as the identified patient because that's secure for me. I'm getting money. I'm able to care for my family. If my risk of returning is, geez, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to perform like I once did. I don't know what my coworkers are going to say. What if I lose my job and I lose my income? And there you have the disability mindset. So it's a pretty complex process that we sort of iatrogenically contribute to in the disability management space, but it's just sort of the natural occurrence within income replacement. And so we have to sort of think about, from a disability management perspective, how do we counter that throughout the stages of what could be leading to the disability mindset.
Wonderful, Kristen. Thank you. And so,
Carol, we had a question posed during Kristen's comments. Kristen, the middle bucket that you described, those who should be returning, how large is that bucket compared to the other two buckets?
I mean, it depends on the makeup of the book of business, basically. Do you have an older population that is in the claim management book? Do you have particular industries that are more subjected to things like musculoskeletal claims or mental health claims? But everybody's at risk. So, I think of it, probably 40% of folks are going to self-resolve, 30% of folks are going to self-resolve. A much smaller percentage of the population, probably 5 to 8% are going to be permanently and totally disabled. And then you've got that middle bucket that's at risk. So maybe, 40% of claims, 50% of claims, somewhere in there. I like to think of it as when we want to target, certain diagnostic categories that are particularly at risk. Think about things like musculoskeletal claims that can actually they're objective, but not. Then you've got mental health claims, certainly, that there's a whole set of ramifications that occur when somebody, anxiety creeps in for a physical condition. Imagine being out for depression and what your mind can do to you about the unknown in returning to work. Things like injury claims are certainly at risk. Cancer claims we find have a lot of opportunity. There's a whole psychology around cancer that folks tend to want to return because that's a sense of normalcy. But again, it depends on the environment. And then heart disease. There's a lot of mental health comorbidities around heart disease. So those are the diagnostic categories that I would recommend any disability management team really focus on. But yeah, that's kind of my best thought in terms of the actual hard numbers, and Kimia might have an opinion on that as well.
Yes, I absolutely echo those top diagnostics there, Dr. Tugman. I mean, I think especially what you mentioned around the disability mindset and countering it, I think that organizations need to think of how to positively reinforce in different ways and how to reward in different ways that might help counteract that disability mindset. Like it says, begin immediately. You could start today in thinking of what can go into, rewarding, recognizing, keeping individuals on that satisfied train instead of having folks, start getting into that disability mindset. Counter it immediately with your culture at work.
Awesome. Thank you, both of you. I want to mention that if you want hard numbers in that space, we have a report on the website, ibiweb.org, on chronic diseases. And it has some really, really interesting stats on return to work. Those numbers are actually improving. And so you might want those if you want hard numbers. All right, so what we're saying, real world strategies to combine this disability mindset is to be proactive, personalize messages, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but we know you're having surgery today and we're thinking about you. Set clear return pathways to educate the employees about recovery, timeline, build confidence, and keep employees connected to work. Isolation and fear is a very big factor. There's another study on loneliness and how that affects health and definitely affects success. And so you'll notice throughout the presentation, I list studies that support these points. And I also list quotes from participants so that you understand where all of this is coming from. One of the things that Wendy said, who is a former colleague of Dr. Tugman's, is nothing you do 6 months from now will have as big of an impact as it would if you do it in the first days. And moving to the psychological factors in this, both of you have touched on this. Two important elements are that expectation and self-efficacy. We've all heard the phrase mind over matter. People who believe they can return to work are more likely to actually do so. So building that confidence and focusing on what they can do instead of what they can't do makes a real impact. But also expectations are important. Allowing incremental progress requires audits of accommodations and how things are going, communication, coordination, those are all things that we'll talk about. But psychological or behavioral support is paramount. Kimia talked about this in our focus groups, this self-efficacy piece. And if you could say something to that, Kimia, I think I have a quote from
Absolutely.
you.
Yeah, self-efficacy, I think, is a huge element in being able to return to work in regards to the individual really believes that they're capable of doing something. And self-efficacy can be anything, right? So there's self-efficacy and then there's return to work self-efficacy. So do I actually believe I am capable of returning to work? So you can actually build your employees just general self-efficacy, but also get an idea of how they are around their return to work self-efficacy. And you could get that whether it's, long before they go out on leave when they're just talking about it. If you're trying to understand, hey, where are you? Maybe you want to get an understanding of how your whole department is in general. There are self-efficacy tools out there to get an understanding of how capable they feel within themselves they are in accomplishing things. So there's different elements to that. And once one believes psychologically that they are capable of getting over a challenge, they are. I assimilated, Carol, when we were initially talking, I assimilated it to Thomas, the little toy engine, the cartoon, the kid cartoon. He says, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. It's his self-efficacy that continues to show while he continues to push harder and harder. He believes in himself. So that self-efficacy really shows through. And in the cartoon, obviously, he is able to, right? And so an individual who believes that they can is able to really overcome those challenges. And that's why return to work self-efficacy is so important. The individual is going in with probably a lower disability mindset as they kind of challenge their own self-efficacy. Can I do this? Am I too disabled to? And there's a little bit of a battle there. But ultimately, if an individual's self-efficacy is strong enough, it can overcome that disability mindset. And it's really important around the support models, whether it's that individual supporting themselves, it might be as small as family supporting that individual, friends supporting, but also coworkers, leaders within the organization, their manager. So there's importance in that support. So kind of it really reverberates all the way out, multiple levels within the organization, all the way up to the top, showing that there are support. There's policies, practices, processes put into place ultimately to guardrail and improve that employee returning to work in the best, most successful fashion as possible.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I think there have also been studies that suggest that too much support will sort of reinforce that disability mindset. But I think it would be important to study that against support from work and support from out, because the claimant will probably lean toward the most support. So if you're leaning toward support at work, you're more likely to go in that direction, more likely. And so I would love to do those studies, but we'll see.
Hey, Carol.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I would just kind of add to that in terms of the theoretical literature. And I know you have it in here, at least in the broader study around there's cognitive adaptation theory and cognitive appraisal theory. And I think what we're talking about here, right, is cognitive appraisal theory, where it's not about like that theory doesn't necessarily talk about having people to lean on that would give you too much support. But what it does do is it explains how we think on a daily basis, and that we're constantly assessing threats around us, whether or not we're on out on disability or just in our general world. All day, every day, we're constantly assessing whether or not something is a threat. And if something is not evaluated as a threat, we move on. If something is evaluated as a threat, then we determine whether or not we have the resources to overcome the threat. And so that's where on the disability space, the employer comes into play, right? Is there a return to work policy? Is there return to work support? Is there a manager who's staying in touch? Are there coworkers who are saying, hey, we're concerned about you and we care about you? And that will allow the person to feel that they have the resources necessary to overcome their situation, that will allow them to move forward and problem solve versus be avoidant. And so that's just another way to think about that thought process.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you. And we talk a lot about that communication piece. You maintain that connection, but I think what we don't talk about is the training, the training for managers and coworkers and their reluctance to overstep boundaries. And one of the things we discussed in the groups is that perhaps you could ask, this could be your protocol, ask, would you like us to stay in touch? How often? Who do you prefer to hear from? Who wouldn't you want to hear from? And that can go a long way. Again, that claimant feels heard and seen and like you value them. So just imagine being away from work for weeks, months, recovering, healing, adjusting. While physical recovery might be underway, there's another challenge, feeling disconnected. And one of the biggest predictors of successful return isn't medical treatment, it's workplace support and communication. So employees who stay connected in their teams, even during their absence, feel more included, less isolated, and like they belong there. Personalized accommodations. I know this is something that is talked about a lot in the absence management world. Work accommodations are consistent predictors of successful return. Many uh, managers, and this is from the focus groups, say that I don't have anything they can do. And one of the things that came up again and again is being creative. Um, one of our participants talked about doing site visits and determining, what can be done. Um, another another thing that came up again and again is to hone in on tasks that the person can do. Maybe they can't do the job at large, but they can do tasks. And that piece, that the job tasks, I was told that that is a big hurdle to overcome. It's usually not readily available. What's the job description? What are the tasks that this person has to do? It doesn't have to be all or nothing, right? So being creative, customized. One of our, Dan Jolove talked about an accommodation of a janitor who was out on disability, couldn't do what he needed to do, and they actually invested in a riding vacuum. And this prevented the progression from short-term to long-term disability. He could have become permanently disabled, but instead he continued to have a meaningful, fulfilling life. Dan spoke of actually him, other workers being excited when he was out. He said, "Can I do the vacuum today?" So these creative solutions definitely boost success.
And Carol, can I just add something to that real quick?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I would just say too, like one of the things that I see and have seen for a long time is that employers often don't really understand the minimum output that they need from their employees in order to consider them productive,
Right.
which is really important. And it gets to your talking about essential functions. But if we can understand what's the minimum output you need from your employees to consider them productive, you can then help prepare them for return to work while understanding the point at which they've recovered enough that they can come back and they can incrementally return to full-time, full duty within a short period of time. And that short period of time, what's really important too, is that it's really based on what the business can sustain. So we want to be able to have those conversations to know, is 2 weeks too long? Is 30 days too long? And then do we need to think about more long-term accommodations? But as best that we can understand that what that minimum output is, right? I mean, how often we always say, the 100% or nothing myth, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what day of the week anybody is 100%, but we're all probably less than 100% on any given day. And so, but we're all considered productive. So what's that point at which we can sort of cross that threshold to know when it's time to allow somebody to incrementally return. And then that incremental return helps that person feel prepared, and it feels like a benefit that my employer really cares about me and they're going to help me get back to where I want to be in my life. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there as a consideration as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Kristen, because absolutely, I think that and probably a lot of employers on I'm going to guess like 3 out of 5, it might be even higher, have outdated job descriptions and outdated, work role descriptions where there's not really an understanding of, like you said, what that task is that need to get done, the minimum task. And then even additionally, over, let's say, the last 10 years, if you haven't opened up your job descriptions, there's been automations, there's been a lot of shifting in those job functions over years, probably more so than historically. And so what we're seeing is a need for folks to kind of use time to get in, lay that boring groundwork. Sometimes it's, not necessarily bringing in new business, but it's going to be laying really important foundation for that. as well as what I was just chatting with a friend in legal, who works around, for compliance and stuff like that for around leave management. And they were saying that 4 out of 5 of the cases around accommodations that they see on their desk in legal is because the manager wasn't trained and supported, and those job descriptions weren't there and clearly documented for it to, become what it is, a legal case at that point. So it's really this, I think this is a very important part to kind of lean into, especially for whether it's managers highlighting, hey, this individual and that's asking for this accommodation, let's look at that. If it's one by one, do that, tackle it little by little. But if it's not going to be like a huge project throughout the organization, but it's definitely well worth looking at those job descriptions, those work tasks.
Thank you. Very good. Yes, I was asked to emphasize that. I appreciate you, Kenya and Kristen. So one of the things that was spoken about is centralized coordination. Another important factor, which is many times overlooked or left to chance, people fall through the cracks. So implementing centralized coordination helps bridge gaps between healthcare, workplace, and insurance systems. It's not easy to navigate those systems. And then you're talking about someone who's sick or injured or anxious or depressed or lonesome. These things come into play. And with a case manager, some of those things can be addressed. One of our participants talked about pointing people to resources, but if there's no designated person to do that, sometimes it gets done and sometimes it doesn't. We also talked about the multidimensional intervention. So we talked about that some people are successful with very little intervention, and some are successful with a lot. And so we said begin with low intensity interventions and sort of crank it up with those audits. So combine clinical and workplace components. Don't forget the psychological component. This is a really big thread that runs all the way through. Provide that education, and don't let those people fall through the cracks. It's got to be a whole ecosystem. Addressing social determinants of health. That's another thing. Sometimes the biggest hurdles aren't at work at all. It can be the disability itself. It could be transportation issues. Sometimes they're disabled, they're not able to drive because of the injury or illness, or they have child care issues or financial stress because finances change in this regard. And it's compounded by medical bills and lost wages and uncertain future, lots of things. So there's also isolation, depression, anxiety. All of these things are social determinants that can derail the whole process. If the company doesn't have resources, you can, if you have that centralized person, you can connect employees with community resources that can help tackle those challenges head on. And the goal is to have successful return to work. The investment is worth it. I think we'll talk about on the next slide. Return on those investments are often undermeasured, undervalued, underestimated. And so failing to put this investment in, which might just be connecting somebody with some free resource, will increase your failures. So this, this is my forte, the measuring progress, measuring success, knowing what success is, defining what productive means, looking at it, tracking it, assessing it. If you don't do that, then you don't know what is and isn't working, and you don't know how to improve it. We can talk about it all day, but when you have raw numbers, it's more impactful. So we have to be strategic in that place. Kimia, I know this is your forte. Can you talk about some of the things we need to measure?
Absolutely. We definitely share our love for measurement.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think that there's some things that are critical in when we talk about returning to work. One is obviously the duration management piece. We know individuals, they, sometimes it's kind of an understanding where I have to explain that it's never going to be zero, right? Like clients, employers, everyone wants this to go lower, lower, lower. Let's get lower duration. Well, let's understand what that ground floor is and then understand where the ceiling is, and let's work in between that space versus continuing to want lower. Let's understand that, this is that number for pregnancy. We should expect this. We should expect if we have more complications in the pregnancy, okay, our numbers might go up. That's where we need to start flagging different kind of number ranges, so to speak, to start identifying, okay, this is a concerning marker versus this is expected. It's bouncing up and down within range. We could do that using benchmarks and stuff like that. But in addition to duration management, a couple additional pieces would be understanding how many claims you have going to max, whether it's bumping up close to it, again, using those markers, those indicators in your data to identify, hey, we're about 2 weeks away from max on this claim. Okay, we need to identify what is pushing a lot of claims to this. What can we do to bring it down, and basically work on the kind of danger zone, the red zone, so to speak, instead of saying, hey, this individual is passing their duration element and just continuing on. Understand where those flaggers are and where did it start. Again, with the early intervention, where could we have intervened to bring this individual back to work sooner. Additionally, in addition to duration management, understanding how many are bumping up against the max, understanding, do we have more claims now transitioning into that LTD and going from STD to LTD? So now immediately we should be seeing our durations go up if we're seeing more of those claims transitioning from STD to LTD. So understanding a couple of those markers will be able to understand if you are having these successes, these mini milestones. You might be doing good in 2, and maybe you have a lot more claims that you need to work on reducing, in that red zone, that danger zone for your max duration. So there's some elements there that might help you identify where to start intervening. But also, you mentioned kind of defining success, defining what that means. Every organization might define that differently. So sitting down with your objectives, your KPIs, identifying where, again, you want it to reach, setting that as an objective. Maybe it's, I want to bring down our duration by a single day. Let's set that as an objective milestone rather than we just want lower duration. Let's be objective about those milestones, bring it down by that one day, see what we did well, and then rinse and repeat. Then we can bring it down maybe by 2 days by expanding whatever program or intervention we put in place. So I think it's really important to be able to define success and as well as continue to track and monitor and measure that as you go on.
That's awesome. One of the things you point to KPIs, there's a whole discussion about OKRs. That's having that objective up front. We're not just looking at numbers. What are we measuring against? And why are we measuring against that? these are things that you need to address up front, and then you can make progress. Yes, very good, Kimia. All right, and again, I want to reiterate that the focus group members that ROI on return to work programs is clear, but indirect benefits are hard to measure. And this makes the programs more vulnerable to budget cuts. Don't underestimate, the return. Try to document the success and how that, even if it is sort of squishy, it's sort of hard to quantify, you can still put it in terms of we didn't lose this employee, or look at replacement costs or that sort of thing.
And Carol, I would just add to that on, as we think about, we used to call them indirect costs, right? And I
Mhm.
think IBI did a really great job back in the day of turning the language into productivity costs.
Yeah.
Because as much as we would get pushback over the years around them being soft dollars, they're actually really hard dollars.
Yes.
And I would challenge employers to really think about these productivity costs around what are your overtime costs, what are your temporary worker costs, what does it cost you when you lose an employee? What are the hiring and retraining costs? And then now we're in this place of thinking about workers left behind. I actually, when I was still with
Yes.
Prudential, I did a study with Aflac where we looked at what are the ramifications of employees left behind now covering for coworkers who are out because our regulatory and leave landscape just gets more and more complicated. So we're seeing state paid leaves and, long story short, people being out longer. So what we realized, we really need a comprehensive program that addresses these leaves, that also addresses the folks left behind, because there's really hard dollar costs around people covering and experiencing their own chronic condition or their own mental health condition as a result, and then they go out of work. So these, again, I would just challenge us to really think about the fact that these are hard dollar costs, and we know engaged employees are productive employees, and they experience less health events and they experience less absence. So just my soapbox around productivity costs and ROI.
Yes, very good, very good. And so some of those things that we need to look at are policy. Some of them are external, legislation, federal, state laws, disability program regulations, regional differences. Some of them are internal, like benefit plans. But those things need to be addressed in this ecosystem. Sometimes some of these policies are they're helpful. Sometimes they challenge the success, but we can eliminate some of those barriers as the employer, the insurer, the provider. So this is that framework, and it looks like a lot, but we've talked about all of this. This is health condition factors. This is your functions, your disability mindset, and then you've got the activities and participation, the cognitive adaptation strategy, discovering purpose in health challenges, finding meaning in this event. And then we have contextual factors, which are environmental. What's happening in the workplace? Is there support there? What's happening with your physical therapist or your healthcare providers? And you have personal factors. I think this is a very big element, and we need to address these more efficiently with self-efficacy, maintaining identity, having a personal story where when you come out on the other end, what does victory look like? Resilience, coping strategies, all of that is psychological. And then you have those policy and systemic factors. All of that needs to be considered in this ecosystem, all of those things, and it needs to be kept in mind. Some of those things are acknowledged but dropped. So, in a nutshell, action plan is to intervene early, contact them within a few days, have centralized coordination, conduct audits of accommodations, provide mental health support, and address social determinants of health. And then we can get to that success, that person who comes back 1.4 times faster with that full ecosystem. And that's all I have on my end.
Oh, Carol, that was an awful lot. Thank you.
I know.
Great. Thank you for the research that you've done and the findings and facilitating those focus groups. Thank you to both Kristen and Kimia for their thoughts as we went through that, because I think it makes it more relevant and practical when we take the research and talk about the real world. We just have a few minutes left. We did have some questions that have come in throughout the conversation. So let me raise these now. For both Kimia and Kristen, it's no secret employers are paring down the size of their workforces, in some cases significantly so. I think this trend would work against wanting to implement a return to work program. What do you think? So Kimia, why don't we start with you? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would argue that it would actually benefit, right? So I think there's return to work. It's more than just return to work. It's also an artifact of your culture within your organization. It's how you reward and believe and trust and are generous with your benefits towards your employees. So return to work is in a way showing the employee, kind of the employer putting their arm out saying, hey, I'm here for you. I want to help you back in a seat where you're happy. Normal activity is what I like to say, because obviously it might be a different job. It might look functionally a little bit different after certain return to works, but ultimately a smaller workforce puts more importance and value in returning to work and putting that the workforce that is currently there back at work and productive.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, I think it becomes more important, to Kimia's point, because we've been saying for years, you don't have employees that work for you as the American workforce has become more and more lean and becoming more and more lean. You don't have employees that you don't need. And so when they go out, you feel it even more. So that makes these programs even more important, and it makes them create even more of a return on investment, because you've got to work with and engage the population that you have. And that includes disability and return to work.
Good. Okay. One more question. Very thought-provoking question as well. So this may take a few minutes, but individual said, I'm hoping you can talk more about helping employees find meaning, especially in situations where they're not able to work, and not just because of the disability, but also because there is no job to go back to. Camille, we'll start with you. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about the word meaning here. So I think that's important, to find meaning. I think everyone is going to define what, meaning really is for them. Maybe an individual would think that their, the support and empathy that they receive from their coworkers and managers at a time when, before they even head out, but during, the time when they're like, hey, I'm about to head out, I'm going to go be taking leave, that's when they're starting to understand that the arm is getting reached out from the employer. They should be seeing the meaning of their worth, their value from the employer's eyes early and often, whether it's from the organization, the manager, or even from the policies and programs that are put in place by the organization, because ultimately that will kind of have the guardrails up for the employer and the managers to put that play into work. So I do think that there's opportunity for meaning. I'm not sure around if there's not a job to return back to. I think that there's often I would wonder why that situation, why they're not able to return to work, and there's some definite nuances around that. But yeah, definitely think there's some opportunities there.
Yeah, I mean, that's super philosophical question, so I love it. I think so. There's a book actually that I'm reading right now called Finding Your Why, Finding Your Way. And so I'm a licensed therapist, and so I'm doing a little therapy on the side as well because I like it. And I think it makes me better actually to know what's really happening for people out there, given the mental health crisis that we exist in. But it's really so meaning, like, so I've done a lot of work around meaning when I think about psychological adjustment, and people, when they psychologically adjust, tend to find meaning in their situation. And it could be as simple as, I was never meant to have that job anyway, and so I'm going to be better. And so you find simple meaning, you find complex meaning. Geez, now I can spend more time with my family and really readjust my priorities. And you might see post-traumatic growth. And I don't know, what if they're obviously there's management element usually in the long-term disability world, but helping people understand sort of what they value can help them find their way. So do I value, my recovery, my health, doing what I need to do to take care of myself, getting back to some level of productivity in helping the community around me can help people find purpose, which is really important. So if my action and my behavior is aligned with my values that I was able to establish, that actually helps you find your way and can help you find your purpose, and can help people sort of move on to that next stage. So I think that's probably a whole webinar we could do on
Yes,
purpose.
I know.
But thank you for the question. I love talking about that stuff.
Yes.
Well, but I think what it does highlight, and Kimia, you mentioned this earlier about your colleagues in the legal team who, the reason they end up on their desk is because the paperwork, the documentation, the job description, physical job demands were not in place, and then it's just nowhere but bad, right? It's only going to go sideways at that point. So this requires an investment of time and resources and thoughtful planning, right? It's not something you can just pull that job description off the shelf from 7 years ago and say, well, here's what they're supposed to do, right? Not only has the role changed over 7 years, but we should be able to find new things to do. And Kristen, to your point, the whole purpose of what's important to that individual. And I'm sure we have some large employers on the call today, and I spent many years in large organizations. You get overwhelmed with the thought of a workforce of 20,000, 50,000 employees. How on earth could I do that? You have to start someplace. And one by one, role by role, case by case, it's an effort to do that, but it can help because not only will you keep those cases off of the law desk, legal team, but you'll have a more fulfilled employee and part of a team and part of an organization. So I think one encouraging word I would leave our audience with today is don't get overwhelmed. This is achievable. I'm sure Kristen and Kimia have seen many best practices in their career and have lots of thoughts on how to implement these type of things, but it is achievable and it's very important to do.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, we are up on the hour. I want to thank our guests, Kristen and Kimia, for their really insightful comments today. Carol, for the work that you did and all of the research and sharing it and distilling it down for today's call. Reminder to our audience, we will send the copy of Carol's slides and a link to the recording just a few days from now. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.